Welcome. Today we're doing a video on installing ArchiveSpace. ArchivesSpace.org. It's a archiving software. It is open source, and we found the documentation to be rather short and a little outdated, to where it makes it a little difficult to get an open source product up and running, which to me is the opposite of what open source is all about. I did find that to try to join and become a member to get more access to technical support was rather odd and difficult. I'm setting this up for one person, and they're really organized around selling this to universities and basing the pricing on the number of people that attend the university or visit the library. So needless to say, a friend of mine, actually two friends of mine, one of them helped me with some of the stuff and another helped me with some of the Linux stuff, and we got it working, and I wanted to put this video together to help you get it working as well. Our first attempt was on 2019 server, which we had all sorts of problems with. So we bagged that and we went to an Ubuntu install, which seemed to work okay as long as you know some of the pitfalls. And that's what we're going to cover in this video. So the first thing we're going to do is get some resources. We go to ArchivesSpace.org. You click under application and you download the latest release, which will take you to github.com. 2.8.1 is our version, and at the very bottom you'll find the zip file that you need. This is the application. Download the file and save that to your desktop or somewhere where you have access to it. Going back to ArchiveSpace, they do have documentation under the technical documentation piece here. Click on technical documentation. They got an overview, which is how the app works, but the main things you're looking for is under installing. A getting started guide, which is really short. And then some information on setting it up as a Unix daemon, which didn't work on Ubuntu. And this one is missing some pieces, which I'll talk about, setting it up under systemd. It has some timing issues with that. So not a lot of details. So that's one of the reasons we also did the step-by-step. So the next thing we did is we went to ubuntu.com, which is here, went to download and downloaded the long-term service release of Ubuntu Desktop 24.2 LTS. We downloaded this. This is a rather large download. Takes a little while, but you're going to need this ISO as well to build the operating system. Finally, I'm using today for our demo a Mac operating system running a virtual platform called Fusion. And you can sign up for VMware and get a free account, go to downloads, and you can download Fusion for a trial, or Workstation Pro if you're on Windows for a trial. Or if you want a free version, they have a product in there under all downloads called Player. And you go under downloads and find Player, and it's free and will do everything you need it to do. Fusion and Workstation Pro, I use Fusion because it has a lot more features for some of the other stuff I do. But Player will just work fine. If you're on an enterprise level system, you probably have ESXi with vCenter, and it's a beautiful thing to build it on that platform. It's a great platform. So needless to say, my Fusion is already installed. That's pretty easy to install, and we're going to take you there now here, and we're going to build, let me minimize this out of the way. We're going to build a virtual machine with Ubuntu. Now, I've done it already, so you're going to find that it already knows where the CD is, but you just have to navigate to where your CD is. So I'm going to go New, and I'm going to say Install from Disk Image. The reason I do that is it tells this software I'm installing Ubuntu. So it's going to automatically put the tools and the VMware tool stuff that I need it to do on the machine for me. It's a real nice feature. So I open that, and I would select Use Another Disk or Image and navigate to the ISO I downloaded from Ubuntu. Now I've already done that, so it actually appears here in the ones that were recently used. So I'll just use that one and hit Continue. The easy install. If this is something you probably don't want, this is nice. It rolls Ubuntu out very quickly. Easily, doesn't ask you a lot of questions, but it installs a whole bunch of stuff we don't need. I'm assuming we're installing this Ubuntu as more of a server than a workstation, so I'm going to uncheck that and hit continue. Hit continue, and then rather than hit finish, I'm going to hit customize because I want to change a couple parameters. When I do hit customize, before I can customize it, it wants me to name the machine. So I'm going to call this ArchivesSpace.1.VMware VM and save it. And now I can customize it. Now, because this is a desktop level virtualization product, it's going to give me some things I don't need. I don't need the camera, so I'll click and remove it. I don't need the sound card, so I'll click and remove it. I don't need my printer shared with my Mac. I don't want this shared. There's nothing there. I'm going to double the memory. So we're going to do 8192 and give it 8 gigs of RAM. Leave it at 2 processors. That's fine. And I'm going to show all. So I got the processor set. The network adapter on a virtualization platform, on a workstation virtualization platform like Fusion or Workstation, it's going to try to share it with your Mac. I went bridged auto detect, and what this means is it will operate as though it's got its own physical NIC card, which is what I want. In ESXi or the enterprise level virtualizations, you will always bridge it. The hard disk I'm going to make a tiny bit bigger. You can make it whatever size. For today, I'm just making it 60. I'm not really putting data on this thing. The CD-ROM should already have selected our Ubuntu and click the box to connect. If it did not in either of these, navigate to your ISO and also make sure it's connected. So when you boot it, it will have something to boot off of. A couple more things I'm going to do just for today under compatibility, since I'm going to be sending this image over to somebody who's going to put it on ESXi. I'm going to bring this down to 15 on the hardware, which means I can take it out of Fusion and give it to somebody with either 6.7 or 7.0 version of ESXi. If you leave it at the higher levels, it won't be available for certain types of programs to export and import it into different virtualization platforms. So I'll apply that. And then the last thing here, oops, sorry, clicked the wrong one. And the last thing I'm going to do here is the startup disk to make sure it boots off the CD. And close that and get going here. So this is the install of Ubuntu. I'm going to close this window behind me so it doesn't get too confusing and center this here. I will resize this later on once it gets installed. It will just keep changing on us until it's done the install. Now I do have a script off to my left that you might not be able to see, but I will be copying commands out of it to make my life easy. And I will post the step-by-step as a text file on my post or as text somewhere for you to copy it. It should bring up the installer wizard here in a minute to help us configure this box, and that looks like what it's doing. So I'm going to click on Install Ubuntu. Now the first time I have to click to get my mouse into the window, and then click on Install Ubuntu. I'll accept that as my keyboard layout. I'm going to do a minimal install. On a server, we really don't want it to install Office and all these other games and products. And I'll hit Continue. I'll let it erase the disks as they are virtual, and I will continue and let it repartition the disks. It did pick the correct time zone for me, so I'll go along with that. Time is important. Here, I'm going to name this. Now, the name I'm going to use is AS user, which is ArchiveSpace user. You don't have to do that. And I'm going to call this just ArchiveSpace the computer, and I will leave my user AS user. The reason we're going to do that is when we install software on a Linux box, we're going to be putting it in this user's home folder rather than the root of the drive, which isn't recommended according to some of my Linux folks that helped me with this program. So this user is really not for somebody to log into the machine with. It's really to run the software. This is more of a software user. So I'll just use something simple for a password. You can do something according to your policy. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Continue. And then I'm going to let this run, and I will kind of pause things and pick back up after it's installed. It installed, it only took about 5 minutes, and I'm going to restart it now. So we have Ubuntu up and running as a virtual machine, and I think we have to push enter there to get that to reboot. Now what you want to do is make sure that disconnected your CD-ROM before you do that. Of course, the script automatically does that, and you can actually check it under here and see that it's unchecked there. When you're in and out of this window before it finishes the VMware stuff, you might have to hit Control-Alt to release your mouse. I'm going to log into Ubuntu using our username that we created with its password. And the next step here is to finish the wizard and install some of the prerequisites. So here we are, these companies trying to get my information. No, thank you. I'll set up that later. I'm going to say no to improve this. Not that I don't want to help them, but this is a lab build and I don't want to send them lab data. And I'll leave the location services off and finished, and we're done. So Ubuntu is installed as a virtual machine, minimalistic. The first thing we're going to do is install one of the prerequisites, which is Java, and specifically Java.8. So I'm going to open Terminal by clicking that and typing Terminal and clicking on Terminal. Now we're going to be using Terminal a lot, so I'm going to right click it and add it to favorites, which will keep it on this bar after you close it. And then you can just click it here. And if you open a new window, you'll see double dots here saying you have 2 windows open. So to install Java, we are simply going to test for Java first. That's ArchivesSpace version. We can see it's not found. However, there's some on the internet. That being said, it is specific that you need the OpenJDK 8 for this, which is Java version 8. So I'm going to do sudo apt install open JDK -8 JDK. And we'll hit enter. I will put the sudo password in, which is your user's. Approve that with a yes and let it install Java. That'll be prerequisite 1 out of the way. We'll also test after this is done with the ArchivesSpace version to make sure that it's actually installed properly. It didn't get us the wrong version. I noticed one time I actually typed and put the 11 in there. I'll clear the screen and we will do the Java version command, and we are running the correct version. The other thing we're going to install are a couple other of utilities. One of them is the net tools. I like to do netstat and use those type of commands, and they're not built in anymore. There's new versions of it, and I'm just so used to the old world stuff. I'm going to do sudo apt install net tools. We'll use those. They're not required, but if you're going to diagnose it and you're going to look at some of the commands I type, you're going to need those. And now I can do things like netstat-ant. This is going to be one of those commands we use to see if the application came up and is hosting its ports. Right now we don't see much, but the ant means show me everything, means not just the stuff we're connected to, but the stuff we're listening on. The n means give it to me a numeric value. Don't try to make this say DNS or something pretty. And the T, for my case, you can omit, but I just wanted to see the TCP version netstat outputs. The next thing we're going to install is curl. We'll be using that to pull a file down. So I'm going to do sudo apt install curl, and I'll let it install that as well. Again, you don't need that if you have another way of pulling the file and putting it in the right place. I just happen to have a curl command to where that actual file is. And I'll clear that, bring us back to the top. So we have Java. The next thing we're going to do is install MySQL. Then we're going to run the secure installation wizard. So to install MySQL, quite easy, same thing. MySQL server, there you go. We'll say yes, let it go. It's one of those things that's just so much easier on Linux than it is Windows, but it's not too hard on Windows. You could download the executable and run it, and it has kind of a GUI installer. If you do install this on Windows, you only need the server component of MySQL. You don't need all the other garbage. If you're a GUI-driven person, you like those utilities, and in some places I do, you might want to install the Workbench so you can manage the SQL environment, but other than that, you really just need the server piece. So we have it running here. We have it installed. And we're going to run a utility. I think I can just tab it out. So I started typing and hit tab. This is a installation wizard to secure the environment. We're going to run this. First thing, do we want to validate and make sure we have complex passwords? I'm going to say no, and you can hit any key. I'm just going to put an N in there. We're going to set the root password for the database. Okay, so the database password's in. I'm going to say yes to remove anonymous users. And this next question is to lock it down a bit so root can't access the SQL database remotely. That's always a good thing, so we'll say yes for that. It comes with a test database. We will say yes to remove that. And to reload the privilege tables now, so all this takes effect, we'll say yes to that. And you've given some security to that environment. Again, it's not perfect, but it's good enough for now. So our MySQL environment is ready to go. To validate it, I am going to do one of two commands. I could do a sudo service MySQL status, and we can see it's running, or I can jump into MySQL, which we're going to be doing here in a moment. So we do see it's running and it's active. So the next thing we're going to do, I hit a Q to stop that, by the way. The next thing we're going to do is create the database, verify the database is there, create a user, set their privileges, and adjust some of the parameters that we found as a problem. And I'll mention those because they do supposedly lower the security of the environment a little bit. So the first thing we're going to do is sudo into the MySQL application, and we can see here we're at the application prompt. And the first thing we're going to do is create a database called ArchivesSpace with the default character set at UTF-8 MB4. And I have that on the script here, so I'm just going to paste it in. You can see create database. The name of the database will be called ArchivesSpace. The default character set UTF-8 MB4, and I'm going to hit enter. And you, on MySQL commands, you always have that semicolon at the end, and I hit enter, and there it made the database. Now I can prove that by show databases with a semicolon on the end, and I can see my ArchivesSpace databases right there. The next thing we're going to do is create a user named AS in the database. And for now, and ease, I'm going to use the password they use on the website, and that's going to make the password AS123. So create user AS at localhost, that means here, identified by AS123. I'll hit enter, and it creates the user. And now I'm going to grant the user all the privileges they need to that database. And I have a script to do that as well. Grant space all space privileges on the database name ArchiveSpace dot asterisk to AS, that user at localhost, ending in a semicolon, and hit enter. So that actually creates the user, gives them the privileges. Now we found one error here using the latest version of Ubuntu and this version of MySQL when we run their installer script. So you can fix their installer script or modify it, or you can set this global variable to set the log bin trust function creators to 1. And I'll let you guys Google that. I did. It was a lovely read right before I fell asleep. So I set that, and that will eliminate an error, because if you get an error during your installation, it's a little hard to reverse where you failed. So I'm going to show you one other trick here as we go through. So I'm going to exit from SQL now, and I'm just going to verify the service status of running. So we see the service is running there. I'm going to hit a Q to quit. We now have our install completed for MySQL, including the database, the user, the permissions. And the next thing we're going to do is copy in the ArchiveSpace folder. What I'm going to do is minimize this out of the way. We'll do this, remind me later. I've got a copy of the zip file. I'm going to copy it from my Mac and just paste it into the desktop. For some reason, the drag and drop's not working for that VM. So what I'll do is I'll right click this and I'll open it. And there's the folder we want. We want to extract it to our home folder. And there's an easy way of doing this. You just click on it, right click and hit extract. And then you can just choose home from the other side. And we'll extract that folder there. It'll come up with a status. It'll run, extract all the files. And when it's done, I'll close this. And I will leave the file there for reference should I need it. So what I'm going to do here is go back to our command prompt. And if I do a cd /, that's our home directory. Print working directory, you can see it's our home and our user. And if I do an ls, you'll now see the ArchiveSpace folder is there. So we needed to extract that. The next thing we need to do is install the Java connector into a folder, specifically a folder underneath this one. So we're going to move into ArchiveSpace, and if we do an ls, you'll see a folder called lib. So we're going to go into lib, and this is where all the jar files are. We need to copy a file into here, and this file is downloaded from the web, and we're going to use a curl command to grab the file from the web and place it into here. And I happen to have that curl command on another window. And it's got to go in the lib directory because that's where the jar files need to be to execute. And I'll show you the command. I'm going to make this window a little bit larger. Should resize. Paste it. So it's a curl command, and it's pulling a file from maven.org. And it is pulling the file called MySQL connector Java, and it's version 8.0.23.jar, and it's pulling it specifically based on the version of MySQL. So if I'm using 8.0.21, I'd pull the 21 file. You can actually highlight this and take this and put this in a browser and stop right here at connector-java and browse to that. And you'll see all the folders, and you can find your version. You can download it manually that way and put it in here, however you want to do it. I'm doing it with the curl, which is easier because I know where it is. So without placing a destination, it's going to curl it or download it right to this folder because I'm already in the lib folder, and I'll just hit enter. And I don't know why I did that as curl as that user, but if I do ls MySQL connector, you can see I have that connector there now. So that's another thing we have to do. The system uses that to connect the application into MySQL. It's going to use that Java connector. So moving forward here, let's go ahead and we're going to modify the config file. Now I'm going to move up one level. We're in the, let me clear this. Working directory. We're in the users directory, but we're in the ArchiveSpace folder. And if I do an ls, you can see all the different folders. We're going to be moving into the config folder now, cd config. And I'll do an ls, and you'll see the config.rb file. This is most of the configuration of the application, especially with how to tie into the database. So we're going to edit this. We're going to add one line and modify two. And to edit, you can use any text editor you want. I'm going to just do a gedit, which is the GUI text editor, and I'll do the name of the file and edit it. Now I'm going to have the first command. It's actually in here already. Let me see. This line right here is pretty much the line we need. Now I'm not going to check this, make sure it's exactly, but I think it is the exact one. And what it does is it tells it the database URL is using a Java connector to MySQL. On this computer, port 3306. Let's check that out. Actually, let me open it up. That we're running that window right now. Let me open another window. netstat-ant, and you can see we're hosting 3306. So that means that's live. And the ArchiveSpace database, the username in the database is AS, and the password is AS123, which was the commands we put in to create the user and the password. And it uses the character code UTF-8. Now I have that file, that command in my text, so I'm going to use that one, even though I think it's identical. Rather than worrying about it, I'm just going to make a new line here, paste in the one from my text file of instructions. It looks pretty much the same. That's the one change. The next thing I'm going to do is a control F and search for JETTY. Here's two lines, app config and app config. We unremark them. When you unremark them, they should turn a different color, and change the Jetty shutdown handler to true. And that's the only changes we need to make in this config file. So I'm going to save this and close it. And that config file is now ready to go. And let me see. The next thing we're going to do is set up the database. So we have the config file ready to go. I'm going to go back one level. And we're back into the, if I print the working directory, we're back into the home user and then the ArchiveSpace folder. And in this folder, you'll see a scripts folder. In the scripts folder are various files and executable scripts, but one of them is for setting up the database. That means Now that you've created the database in the user and MySQL's running, you've given this application the config to know how to connect to it. This script actually goes in and creates all the tables and indexes and fields and things. So this is one where you get to this point and you say, I want a way to roll back to this point, because if this fails because of something, I can't really roll back. So one of the things that's nice about some of these products from VMware is I can go up here, and you don't have to do this, but I'm going to take a snapshot and call this just before the DB setup script. So if I do take, and you'll see now I'm here, if it messes up, I can click here and I can restore this and not save this place. It'll take you right back to here, and that's how snapshots work. If you're curious how snapshots work, I'm not really covering that in this video, but there's 1,000 things online with VMware and how to take a snapshot. It gives me a rollback capability. Eventually, I'm going to want to come back and just delete this. Doesn't affect the running machine, and because you don't want to save snapshots around, you just use them as a mechanism to roll back before we do something major that could kind of mess things up. So I'm going to go into the scripts folder, and you can see we have quite a few, but the one I'm mainly interested in is the setup database, and we're going to run the shell script for that. And if you see bat, those are the Windows ones. So we're just going to run this and hopefully not get any errors. So you kind of want to keep an eye on this. You've got to spot the errors. A lot of times you'll see a lot of exclamation points when it has an error. And if you look above the exclamation points, you'll find an error or a reason for the error. But what you want to do is stuff like this, where it says migrating, setting up table, beginning, finishing. Those are all good types of things. You can see it adding tables and fields and indexes and stuff like that. Doesn't take long, but if it finishes well, it should say all done at the end or something similar to that. And there we go. At the end, all done. It all took of 10 seconds. So without any errors in here, we've completed through the setup. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that snapshot, because again, keeping snapshots around for development is fine, but for production machines, it's not a great idea, because in the VMware world, it doubles the amount of space and slows the speed by half. So we'll just delete that so it's gone. And next time I do a critical step that I might want to roll back to, I can take another snapshot. So currently we don't have any. All right, the next step after we did the database setup is to basically run the program for the first time, okay? And we're going to run the program for the first time and verify that the program works. And then the second half of that is to set it up to run as a service. So the way we do that is I'm going to go back, and let me clear my screen so you got a nice clean screen to look at, and I'll print my working directory. You can see I'm in the home, my user account under the ArchiveSpace folder, and we have a lot of different folders here, and the one we're going to be dealing with is the script called ArchiveSpace.sh. This starts it. So the way you can use this is you can do ArchiveSpace sh and just hit enter. And if I do that, what will happen is it'll lock this window up and it'll show you running logs. Now I like to do that the first time I run it to make sure there's no errors. The other way to do it is to do a start command, that's to start it, a status command to see if it's running, and a stop command to stop it. We're not going to do any. I want to show the interactive piece. So I'm just going to run it, and this kind of lets me watch what's going on. It does take up this screen, and if I close the screen, I close the program, so I won't. But I can see it's running. It's running through a bunch of different script commands. The start service is up. I don't see anything terrible error-wise. So what I'm going to do is right-click on the terminal and open a second terminal window. And I'll put that over here, and I'm going to show you the netstat. Again, netstat's a networking tool, and I'm going to do ant. And this should show us, and you can see there's a whole bunch of new ports starting up. The main ones we're looking for, 8089, 8090, 8091. The 8080 should be coming up soon, 8081. Let's just hit up there and run the command again and see if they're starting to come up. 8088, 8080, 8081, 8082. So these start to come up. That's the service for ArchiveSpace that's listening, and that's good news. If these don't come up, that's bad news. That means things aren't working too well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just check what the IP address of this is. The IP address this box received, because I didn't set mine static, is that. Now this will be different on yours, and hopefully you set a static for yours on your network, but I'm just using this off of my wireless network here. So I'm going to try to browse to this running service, and going to do it right from my Mac. So what I'm going to do is HTTP, and then we'll put that in. I got one too many slashes there. And you do :8080. That's the port for it. There's an administrative one. I'm not going to go through how to use the product, but this is just to test it. So I'm going to hit enter. And you can see scrolling in the background the logs, and it's basically tracking my connection, what it sent in and out of this screen. And I'm going to log in. And I'll just skip that. And I'm in the program, and then somebody who knows how to use this program is going to have to set up a repository and all sorts of fun stuff. So the nice thing is it works. I'm going to close my browser, and I'm going to Control-C this screen, which should kill the program. And to see if the program is dead, I'm going to go back to my netstat, and you'll start to see these ports that were open and live start to all turn to time wait. And as we run the command, I'm sorry, I'm going to minimize this one out of the way so it's a little clearer. As we run the command a couple times, the sheer number of ports will start reducing as they all time out. We'll get back down to the original 5 or 6 that we're hosting. Again, what you have listening on TCP with this command is different for everybody. If you do the instructions the way I've given them, you should end up with just these listeners up here when all this times out. Now, the reason I'm going to wait for it to time out is because I do the next step is going to start to tie it into a service, and I want to know that these ports started up all on their own and they weren't left over from before. And these will time out based on whatever their thresholds are set. And you can see if I clear the screen, it only took a minute to wait. We're down to nothing. There's nothing running from there. We're back to the defaults that we're running. Here's the Mysql machine and some other things on this box. So that being said, now we're going to set it up to run as a systemd service file. And to do that, we're going to create a file in an operating system folder for this Linux box, and we're going to paste in a bunch of text. Now I have the text saved and we're going to paste it in, but I will post it as well. So what we're going to do is we are going to sudo, and I will use gedit just to make it the same. A lot of times I'll use nano or vi. And we're going to put it in lib systemd system, and I hit the tab. If you're not familiar with Linux, you hit the tab and it should finish if you got the path right. And then you're going to give this a service name, and I'm going to call this ArchivesSpace.service. Let me just double check myself. Yep. ArchivesSpace.service. I'm going to copy in my text, and I will show you what that looks like. So when I hit enter here, it'll ask me for my password, and I'll get my screen, new file. So we're going to paste this in, and this is the contents of the service file. Again, it's in lib systemd system, and the name of the file will be ArchivesSpace service. You can name it whatever you want, but if you change the name, remember to change at the commands forthcoming. What it does is it gives it a remark. This is just my note. The unit gives it a description, ArchiveSpace application, and then it tells it to start after syslogin network, so it's waiting for some things to come up. We tried putting Mysql in here because it does depend on Mysql, but we noticed that the timing doesn't quite work out, so we do something a little later in this particular service file to make sure it works. Wanted by multi-target user, this is so that when you enable the service, it's going to add the correct symbolic links to the startup processes for initd and things like that. Just make sure you include this line under the install header. Under the service, you have type equals forking, which means it can actually call on other processes. You have your 2 commands for starting and stopping. This will allow you to use the system control to start and stop the application. When you tell it to use the system control to start it, it will run this command. And I'll show you this manually. We're going to run it. And when you tell it to stop, it'll use this command. And of course, its path is exactly where I put it in my user, home user, and the ArchiveSpace folder. And if you used a different user account, you're going to have to make sure that you change that. We did remark out the PID file. We had some problems with that because nothing calls on the PID. We were having problems with that. So when we remarked that out, that was kind of like the final bug, if you will, that we had problems with. So that's left there for reference, but it didn't work for us, so we left it out. The PID really identifies when it runs whatever process ID it gets. It records it so that if something else has to reference the process ID, it can. But we don't believe there is anything else referencing it. We also mentioned the user and then the group. This is the user account that we created, and it's also mentioned as the group, which means that of the user. So you would put your user account A user in there, AS user, unless you use something else. And these two we added was another piece that we resolved. We found that the service file that they have up on archivespace.org, it doesn't take into consideration how long it takes for Mysql to start, how long it takes for Mysql to mount to databases, and the behaviors inside a virtual machine are so much faster and more difficult to time. So by putting restart on failure, and the restart is 20 seconds, it fixed the timing issues, and the software comes up perfectly every time. So we make this file, we save it, we're closing it. It is now inside the lib system daemon system, and I'll just do and list it there. You can see our file is there. So that's our service file. That's the hardest part with the most copying. And the next thing we're going to do is create a symbolic link, and we need to create a symbolic link under the other place you'll find system daemon. It's the exact same path, but instead of being in the lib, it's in the etc. So I'm going to move there, and I'm going to do it right underneath here so you can see the paths nearly identical. And I was getting confused into which one to use, but what you do is you put the service file in the lib, and you create a symbolic link, and we're going to point to that. So what we're going to do is move into this folder, and then I'm going to do an ln-s, which means create a symbolic link, and I'm going to point it to lib system daemon system and all the way to my ArchiveSpace service. Now if I wanted to name this shortcut or symbolic link, I could. If you just hit enter here, it'll name it ArchiveSpace service, which is what I want. So I'll hit enter there, and I forgot to, sudo. I'll have to put that in my instructions. And let me just, okay. So we see that that is in this folder now. If you do an ls-l, you can actually see the ArchiveSpace service is a symbolic link and where it points to our real service file. And that's how Ubuntu wants this to work. Now, whenever you make a change to that file, the system doesn't automatically recognize it. It basically recognizes only what was there when it boots. If I do system ctl, which is the command, status, and I can do Mysql, and you'll see it gives me the status for Mysql. If I do the ArchSpace service, it does see it there, but because we made changes to those files, we should run this to reload the daemon. And that's whenever you make changes to that file, you need to update and reload that daemon, or a reboot will obviously do it as well. So we're at a point now where we have just about everything that we need. We can test the service to start first. And to do that, I will system ctl start, and we're going to start the ArchiveSpace service and get it running. You notice it doesn't lock our screen up now. It should be running. We can actually do the status one, and we can see the ArchSpace service is running right here. And opening another window here, Let me clear this one. I'm going to do that netstat-ant. And I can see these ports starting to come up. They do take a few minutes. So if you keep running it, you'll see more and more ports. Because that's how the system boots. What we're looking for is ultimately when you start seeing 8080 and 8081, you're getting towards the end of the boot process for this application. I can see it there. So now I started it and run ArchiveSpace as a service. I'm going to test it again from my Mac here. And this was HTTP 192.168.250 dot, and I've got to remember what the IP address was. It was 154.80.80. Hit enter. And it is working, so I'll log back out again. Okay, so we have the Symbolic link created. I'm just going to remind you that's an Etsy system daemon and system. And I'll just do, you can see that service there. And it's also actually let me just, I'll look for anything in lib, that the actual service file is there. We have a system control status. We have the ability to look at the ArchiveSpace service now, and you can see it's part of the system. However, it's not running. We have one more step to do, which is to enable it. And the way we do that is the system CTL enable ArchiveSpace. I think I might need to sudo this. System CTL enable ArchiveSpace.service, and I'll put my password in, and now it should be enabled. So now we're going to reboot. After doing that, it should come up on its own, and that's going to be the real test. So let's reboot, and let's see if that actually happens. What I'm going to try to do is hit this before the box comes up to show you that it's not working. And we want to see it in a server. We want to see that service come online completely without any user intervention. And that's how you really want to always test your servers, that they do work that way. So we can see in the background it's back up and online, but our application's not up. But if you recall, it took a little while to load all those services and get those ports up and running. So we're going to give it a minute. All right, I gave it about 30 seconds. And the person can now manage it. So we have a successful entire setup on Ubuntu of the ArchiveSpace with the Mysql and step-by-step instructions. Hopefully somebody will benefit from them. Thanks for watching, everyone. Have a great day.